Thank you for coming to this talk. Dr. Jay Budziszewski is a professor of government and philosophy at the University of Texas at Austin. He is an authority on natural law, divine law, moral character, moral self-deception, happiness, and ultimate purpose, and has written widely on topics of family and sexuality, religion and public life, toleration and liberty, and the unraveling of our common culture. His books for a broad audience include, under this talk today, How Not to Be Happy, How to Stay Christian in College, On the Meaning of Sex, and What We Can't Not Know, a guide. Among his academic books, the most recent are a series of line-by-line commentaries on St. Thomas Aquinas. You can find out more at his personal website, The Underground Thomist, which includes a popular weekly blog. Please welcome Dr. Jay Budziszewski.
There we go. You can hear me now. Weren't you impressed with how well he pronounced my last name? That's after only one night of practice. I'm impressed myself. Very few people can do that. I get called all sorts of things. I've been called, my name is Budziszewski, but I've been called Budweiser. I've been called Bottle of Whiskey, and they weren't kidding. Okay, and all sorts of things. Every now and then somebody will say something like, oh yes, my husband has a difficult name too, it's Green. I don't know how to work that. How and how not to be happy. That's what I'm going to talk about tonight. Are people happy? It's difficult even to know whether people think they are. The Harris Poll of American Happiness, reporting in 2017 on whether people call themselves happy, reported low numbers, 33%. That's pretty dismal, isn't it? But on the other hand, the Gallup poll, reporting only 3 years later in 2020 on whether people say that they are satisfied with their personal life, which sounds pretty much like the same thing, said they reported very high numbers, about 90%. The difference isn't because people suddenly became happier in those 3 years. The difference is, as a matter of fact, the Gallup percentage was almost as high in 2017 as it was in 2020. It's because of how the question was asked. Now, usually when people's responses to a question are that sensitive to phrasing, that also suggests some confusion in the mind of the person who's answering. I don't think we're going to learn much from such numbers. My own suspicion is that although most people have some share in happiness, not many are simply happy. A 19th century economist, F.Y. Edgeworth, do we have any economics majors here? No? Okay. Well, economics majors know who he is. He was a 19th century fellow. He believed that someday we would have instruments to measure happiness, just as we have instruments to measure temperature. He thought happiness was a physical quantity like temperature and that it would be measurable. Imagine a physician's assistant putting a happiness thermometer in your ear and saying to you, well, sir, you're only registering 5.6 units of bliss today. Are you feeling a little off? I think the idea is absurd. We can't measure happiness with instruments unless by this we mean the instrument of thoughtful conversation. I'm going to get a little closer to you here. I think the only way to know what makes people happy is to talk with them. To talk with them, well, what does that mean? Do you mean just asking them a bunch of questions like what makes you happy and then collating all the answers? Well, a lot of social scientists think that that's going to tell you the answer. That is exactly their methodology. That's what they do. And there's been an explosion of books It's sometimes called the happiness industry, an explosion of books reporting their results. Well, this makes you happy. This makes you happy. But I think this is nonsense, too. Now, don't get me wrong. Most people do know something about happiness. I don't think it's nonsense because people don't know anything about it at all. If people didn't know something about it, where else would we start? If people didn't already know something about it, how would we even know that there is such a thing as happiness? Since outside of science fiction, there are no such things as happiness thermometers. But consider, even if happiness were just having good feelings, do people always even know how they're feeling? I don't think happiness is the same as good feelings. But even if it were, do people even know how they're feeling? All day Tuesday, Mr. Smith snaps at everybody around him. His wife knows that he's feeling grouchy. His children know that he's feeling grouchy. His co-workers certainly know that he's feeling grouchy. But he's oblivious to the fact. He doesn't know it. He might even be angry and defensive if somebody says, "Why are you so angry today?" or "Why are you in a bad mood?" Although we tend to overlook the fact it's even possible to have a share in happiness itself without knowing it. And it's also possible to be unhappy without knowing it, although people often have a better understanding of what makes them unhappy than of what makes them happy. So, all right. Although it makes sense to begin with common opinions about happiness because people know something about it, it doesn't make good sense to end with common opinions about happiness because they don't know a lot about it and are often confused about what they do know. The way we get beyond these common opinions then, even though we're starting with them, is to make them cross-examine themselves. Our task is to sift through ideas that we already have in order to separate the grain from the chaff. The way to do this isn't to pull ideas down out of the blue, but to, well, as one philosopher once put it, to assemble reminders of things that we already sort of think that we maybe know, and use them to reconsider other things that we maybe sort of think we know. Wise persons are persons who have done this well. Wise doctrines are they embody the results of this procedure. Reflecting on them, we say, how could I have not seen that? I see it now. It isn't as though the insight that you get this way strikes you as something you never would have dreamed of in 1,000 years, but you may never have thought about it. My favorite example of making common opinion cross-examine itself comes from one of the Socratic dialogues. You know, Socrates was this fellow back in ancient Greece. He was the teacher of Plato, who was in turn the teacher of Aristotle, and he made a pest of himself by going around town and having conversations with people. He was considered entertaining. They would sometimes invite him to gatherings of people who were giving a talk or something like that. But he made a pest of himself because he would ask people questions and it would annoy them, because at the end of these questions they would sometimes discover they didn't know what they were talking about. A fellow in the dialogue, this is called the Gorgias because a guest had been invited to somebody's home and the guest is called Gorgias. But we're not interested in Gorgias. There's another fellow in the dialogue named Callicles. Callicles, at a certain point in the discussion, invokes the common opinion that happiness lies in having the greatest possible appetites or desires, but also having the greatest possible power to satisfy those appetites or desires. If you had enormous appetites but enormous power to satisfy them, man, wouldn't you be happy? Well, Socrates backs him into a corner. He says, so if you itch, you have a desire to relieve the itch. Yes, that's an appetite or a desire. So the happiest thing then, the most desirable of all things, would be to itch as much as possible but have great power to scratch. Well, that's very silly. But ashamed to contradict himself, Callicles says, yes, that's right. In his brilliant but annoying way, Socrates goes on to make Callicles commit himself to more and more ridiculous and frankly even disgusting positions. For example, he says, well, would the itching then, Callicles, have to extend to every part of the body? And by asking that question, he forces Callicles to concede that even a catamite, who is a boy or a man who seeks to be sexually penetrated, would have to be considered so happy so long as he kept getting what he wanted. Callicles won't admit that his opinion is mistaken. But it's clear to everybody who's listening that he's lost this round. Now, what's happened here? It's not that Callicles is dead wrong about everything. There are several grains of truth in what he says. He's not mistaken to think that happiness has something to do with the satisfaction of desires. He's not mistaken to think that anything rightly deserving the name happiness would be abiding rather than fleeting. It would be enduring. It would be persisting. It wouldn't just be here today and gone in the next 10 minutes. The problem is that he doesn't separate the grain from the chaff. He lumps all desires together, good and bad. He thinks that to moderate any desire is to be as good as dead. And he doesn't consider the sense in which true happiness would have to abide, in which it would have to persist, in which it would have to endure. If you think, well, you desire as much as possible, but you can satisfy all those desires at the same time, the picture that you get there is of water pouring into a bathtub, and at the same time the drain is wide open, and the water's rushing out as fast as it's coming in. So yes, the level in the bathtub stays at a certain level. It doesn't go down. But is that what we mean by the enduring quality, the persisting, the abiding quality of happiness? Most people would say no. Not abiding in that sense. Socrates helps us to see that if Callicles were right, there really would be nothing happier than the most intense and continuous itching and the most intense and continuous scratching. And can't we all see that this is false? You see what I mean by connecting the dots, making common opinions cross-examine themselves. Socrates hasn't shown us what happiness is through this little exchange. All he's done is shown that a certain common opinion about it is false. False. But, you know, even the accumulation of exploded errors is a kind of a progress. Little by little, we get there. Eventually, we may be able to figure out the decisive questions. Perhaps eventually be able to begin answering them. Well, that's the approach that the classical thinkers took. Not just Christian, I'm in the University Catholic Center, but even the pagans, the greatest of the pagan thinkers, took that approach. Aristotle did. He was a pagan. He takes it in his book, The Nicomachean Ethics. If you're wondering why he gave it such a funny name, he named it after his son, Nicomachus. I think that's kind of sweet. Well, anyway, in the Nicomachean Ethics, that's what he does. He cross-examines common opinions, like does happiness lie in wealth? Does it lie in honor? What does it lie in? Thomas Aquinas, the great saint, one of the 2 or 3 greatest thinkers in all of history, takes the same approach in his treatise on happiness and ultimate purpose. One by one, St. Thomas cross-examines the common opinions that happiness lies in wealth, that it lies in honor, that's other people thinking well of you, that it lies in fame, your name is on everyone's lips, that it lies in glory, that it lies in power, that it lies in the bodily goods, health and beauty, that it lies in pleasure, and he makes each of these common opinions cross-examine themselves. You know, it's funny, it's kind of hard to have a conversation about these sometimes because people may hold these opinions but not admit it. When I ask many of my students in class, what do you think happiness is? They will hardly ever say, I think happiness lies in wealth. But on the other hand, I say, what are you majoring in? And they tell me, and I say, why are you majoring in that? And a lot of them will say, because that way I'll be able to pull down the big bucks. Okay, so obviously they are holding this common opinion. And we need to think about them. We need to make each common opinion cross-examine itself, like Thomas Aquinas did. And just as Socrates did with Callicles' opinion, Thomas Aquinas shows, little by little, first, that each of these common opinions is mistaken, but just as with Callicles, each one contains a grain of truth. Callicles was wrong to think happiness is just satisfying your desires, whatever they are, but on the other hand, it must have something to do with the satisfaction of desire. All right, there's a grain of truth, and Thomas Aquinas points to a grain of truth in even these. Take that one about wealth, for instance. Well, we do need some material things, don't we? We need to have clothing, we need to have food, we need to have some shelter, we need to be able to take care of our children. Obviously, material things matter to some degree. The mistake lies in thinking, oh, therefore, the more of it we have, the happier we'll be. That's where the mistake comes in. And there's a good lesson here about the grain of truth lying in every error. The only reason that we ever believe anything that's grossly mistaken, have you ever thought about this? The only reason that we ever believe anything that's grossly mistaken is because of this grain of truth in it. That's what misleads us. That's what draws us in. That's like the sweet nectar that draws the fly into the Venus flytrap. The best liars know this too. That's why a really good liar doesn't just tell you everything that's false. He packs as much truth into his lie as he can, and he only gives a little twist at the end, which sets all the gears running the wrong way. But the best philosophers and theologians, thinkers in general, try to separate the impurities from the ore, the grain from the chaff, and give us something closer to pure silver. Well, I think we can expand on Thomas Aquinas' procedure. I'm not going to just rerun for you all of these refutations of common opinions that he went through. But besides cross-examining the common opinions that he mentions, he didn't ever claim that they're the only kinds of common opinions you could cross-examine. He just said at a certain point, you see where this is going? We can cross-examine some of the others. For example, on one recent occasion, I asked my students in one class, what is happiness? I said, what is happiness? And I was kind of surprised because I get a different response than I usually get when I ask that question. The first half dozen students all gave variations on the same answer. Nothing but freedom from pain and suffering. Nothing but freedom from pain and suffering. In other words, they were telling me what happiness isn't. It's not pain and suffering. But they still weren't telling me what it was. This was only the negative element here. The negative element so filled their minds that they were completely unable to suggest anything positive that happiness might be. It's easy to see why if somebody is desperately, desperately unhappy, he might have lost the ability to imagine anything better than freedom from sadness and hurt. Isn't it? And it's certainly true that a person who is consumed by pain and suffering can't be called happy. That's the grain of truth here, too. Now, I think there's a very great difference between those truths and the idea that happiness is nothing but freedom from pain and suffering. But still, if we did expand on Thomas Aquinas' procedure, this is not one of the common opinions that he considers, but we could consider it. We might consider the common opinion that happiness lies in nothing but freedom from pain and suffering, or if we wanted to, we could consider its close Buddhist cousin, which is that happiness lies in annihilation. Then you won't suffer, because you will not even be a self, an ego anymore. And I think that we will find that the answer is wrong, that happiness doesn't lie there. Another common opinion that he doesn't consider, but that we could consider, is that meaning or commitment is happiness. I mentioned the happiness industry, all these books that are being written about this. Usually they include a chapter or a section about how people who have some meaning in their lives are happier. You know, they never ask whether the meaning is true. They say people who have meaning in their lives is happier. I don't doubt it. But there are two problems here. One problem is that you might be building your castle of happiness on a self-concocted meaning that just isn't true. That just isn't true. Can a life whose satisfactions are based on delusion be called happy? Now, interestingly, most people say, well, no. We're tempted to sometimes say yes because we get confused and think happiness is just having good feelings, and a person who is basing his life on a delusion but didn't know it was a delusion might have good feelings. Yeah, could be. But do we call that a happy life? Do we call that a fulfilled life? Do we call that a flourishing life? Do we call that everything that a human life needs to be? We don't. The other problem is that even if you get the meaning of things right, think about it. There's two different ways you can know something. One is that you can intellectually know, yeah, that's what things mean, as though you were writing it on a blackboard, as though it was the proof of a theorem. But the other is to be taken up into that meaning. But I'm getting ahead of myself here because that's a hint about the vision of God, which I don't want to talk about until later. So let's put that aside. Still another common opinion is that love or friendship is happiness. When I was in high school, you know, the Beatles were a big thing. You've heard of them, okay? Nobody listens to them anymore. But they used to have a song, Love Is All You Need, and it was very monotonous. So the refrain just went, love is all you need, love is all you need, and people would say this all the time, love is all you need. Many people do, whether they've heard of the Beatles or not, they live by that, or they try to live by that. And, you know, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. No two people can be everything to each other for long. And don't misunderstand me. They burn out like this, and they lurch, they're discouraged. They often lurch to the opposite extreme. I don't need love, I'm going to be tough. But love is wonderful. Love is wonderful. I'm profoundly in love with my wife. Love is wonderful, but it isn't enough. Love stirs up two longings, not just one. There's the longing for the other person, and that longing can more or less be satisfied. But mixed up with the longing for the other person is the fragrance of eternity. That's what makes love seem magical. And just because the other person isn't eternity, love can't fully satisfy that other longing that it stirs up. Still another common opinion is that virtue is happiness. I don't hear that from people very often, but a lot of us were raised on ideas like this. People would say, well, virtue is its own reward. Have you heard that? Virtue is its own reward, and the reward, I guess, is supposed to be if you're virtuous, you'll be happy. I doubt that many people believe literally that virtue is its own reward, but some do. The ancient Stoics did. This was a group of Greek and Roman philosophers, and they believed this. They thought that the virtuous man is the happy man. If you have perfect virtue, the sage, the wise man who has perfect virtue, you will be perfectly happy. Nothing can touch you. Nothing can make you unhappy. You can have your arm cut off. You have virtue, you'll be happy. You can be exiled, be apart from all of your friends, all of your family. Well, you'll be happy. You can be starving. This is what they believed. Marcus Tullius Cicero says in a dialogue with this. Marcus Tullius Cicero was interesting because sometimes he talked that way. Other times he didn't. In a dialogue with one of his friends, Brutus, he says, every virtuous person is happy. Brutus asks in reply, even in torture and on the rack? You know, the most convincing testimony that the Stoics couldn't really live with their doctrine, that virtue is all you need, was their defense of suicide. The Stoic philosopher Epictetus said, remember this, the door is open. Be not more timid than little children. But as children say, when the thing they're doing no longer pleases them, I will play no longer. So do you, when things seem to you of such a kind, say, I will no longer play and be gone. He means kill yourself. But if you stay, he says, do not complain. St. Augustine of Hippo saw through that. He saw that this so-called happiness of the wise man is closer to despair. He wrote, I'm at a loss to understand how the Stoic philosophers can presume to say that all these things that happen to you are not ills, even though at the same time they allow the wise man to commit suicide and pass out of this life if these things become so grievous that he cannot or ought not to endure them. Oh, happy life, said Augustine, which seeks the aid of death to end it. If it's happy, let the wise man remain in it. But if these ills drive him out of it, then in what sense is it happy? You might think that virtue is all you need would be the Christian answer because we think virtue is important. Of course we do. But that's not actually the Christian answer. We might even, now, there's a grain of truth here too. You can't do without virtue. You can't do without virtue. You won't be happy if you don't have it. That's different than saying you have it and you'll be happy. We might even ask whether happiness all comes down to luck or good fortune. Many nations do put a goddess of luck in their pantheons. The Romans had one, Fortuna. Gamblers murmur invocations to her, Lady Luck. An old Broadway favorite complains, they call you Lady Luck, but there's room for doubt. At times you have a very unladylike way of running out. Machiavelli, not usually thought of as anything like a Broadway composer, actually talked a lot about this in his famous book, The Prince, where he's giving advice to a rather bloodthirsty person who wants to attain rule. He talks about Fortuna. We don't know how seriously he did this, but he spoke of her, he personified her. He did speak of her as a goddess. He admired the Romans, maybe he was a pagan in that sense. He spoke of luck as a fickle woman who tended to give her favors, such as they were, to audacious young men who treated her roughly. So he said, be bold. Yet, you know, nobody really thinks that luck is omnipotent. Another one of the ancient writers, Plutarch, really interesting guy, said, nobody wets clay with water and then leaves it, assuming that by chance and accidentally there will be bricks. Nor after providing himself with wool and leather does he sit down with a prayer to chance, a prayer to luck that they will turn into a cloak and shoes for him. Now, no doubt there are a lot of other goods that we might have considered. Does happiness lie in this? Does happiness lie in that? Does happiness lie in the other thing? But I think maybe the drift of the argument is becoming sort of clear. Just in case, let me summarize where it's going, or whether I think it's going, or whether I want it to be going. Above all else in this life, yes, happiness does need virtue. It's not the end of the story, but it does need virtue, because for whatever other goods we may possess, they will scarcely be good for us if we don't have good character. Have you ever read any of the stories about people who have won the lottery? It's amazing how often their lives go to pieces. They can't handle it. They don't have the character necessary to know what to do with that stuff. For this reason, Aristotle once remarked, good fortune in excess might better be called bad fortune, because it's not good for you. Okay, so if we don't have virtue, we won't even know how to enjoy or make use of the other goods we have, and we certainly will not know how to endure adversity. So virtue is important. But contrary to the view of the Stoics, virtue alone is not sufficient for happiness. It's not going to make me, I'm not going to be overjoyed because of my virtue when my arm is being sawn off. Happiness then requires not only virtue, but a sufficiency of the other good things. Good character, yes, but also good fortune. Yes. We might call that the worldly wise man's view of happiness. Cultivate virtue and hope for luck. End of lecture. No, not end of lecture. From one point of view, that would seem to be a pretty good answer. There is a certain heft to it. Many people would more or less agree with it if it were presented to them. Perhaps most would. It does tell us how to guide ourselves, what to aim for. In fact, if I told you all of the practical advice that I tried to put in my book when I was working through all of these false answers to the question, what is happiness? It would take hours. There's a lot that we can say here. And not only that, but cultivate virtue and hope for luck tells us how to teach the young, tells us how to provide for their futures, tells us a lot of stuff. But from another point of view, the answer is pretty shabby, isn't it? Isn't it really? Even its defenders admit that kind of happiness that you get just by cultivating virtue and hoping for luck, just by your own powers and some good fortune, is radically incomplete. It's fragmentary. It's vulnerable. It is imperfect. Did we work through all of these arguments? And I don't just mean the arguments in this lecture tonight. Did all those centuries of thinkers working through, gee, does it lie in this, does it lie in this? Did we work through all of those arguments? Did we do all this work just for that? But what's wrong with this answer? What's wrong with saying happiness is virtue plus luck? I say shabby, but why should we? What's shabby about it? I mean, what's wrong with it apart from the obvious fact that we might not have luck? What's wrong with it is that not even virtue plus everything else can satisfy us. Not even virtue plus everything else can lull all desire, to use Thomas Aquinas' expression. Permit me to use myself to illustrate the point. In the midst of certain experiences, sometimes when I least expect it, there comes over me a certain longing. It's a desire for a far something that neither fortune nor character can provide. You know, there are a lot of things that stir it up. But often it stirs up when I gaze into the face of the moon and the starry sky since I've been a kid. You know, I look up there and I used to want to howl almost. Sometimes this longing is stirred up when I look, really look, upon the face of another person. Especially my wife. It has sometimes happened when I look at somebody else's face, but I look more at her face. So I have the opportunity for that experience more often. I see in retrospect that I've experienced this longing since childhood. But I didn't know it when I was a child. I didn't recognize it. I didn't realize, oh, I've experienced that before. I didn't start having that kind of introspection, that kind of self-knowledge, that kind of retrospect until I was a little older. I wasn't sufficiently reflective to be aware of this desire until my early teens. The desire is not constant in strength. At times I can almost forget it, and yet it is profound and compelling. Now, not everybody talks about this sort of thing. Sometimes people say, well, I haven't experienced that. I think that it's like when I was a child. They may have experienced it and not recognized it. They might have thought it was a longing for something other than what it was for. But I think most people have actually experienced it, whether while contemplating the celestial chords like me, or say while walking in a forest. There comes over you something. Hearing the call of a mourning dove, you know, that haunting sound. Watching the intricate beauty of a dance. For some of you, maybe grasping a mathematical truth when you've been struggling and struggling and you didn't get it, and the teacher was trying to explain, you didn't get it, and suddenly you see it. Yes, it has to be true, and it is so beautiful. Or even seeing the world reflected in a mirror. Whittaker Chambers seems to have experienced it upon gazing at the convolutions of his newborn baby's ear. He says that it was at that moment that he passed over from atheism, he had been a communist, to theism. C.S. Lewis speaks of it as that unnameable something, desire for which pierces us like a rapier at the smell of a bonfire, the sound of wild ducks flying overhead, the very title of The Well at the World's End, the opening lines of the poem Kubla Khan, the morning cobwebs in late summer, or the noise of falling waves. That one does it for a lot of people. Elsewhere, he tells upon how, upon reading the first lines of a poem by Longfellow, he, quoting again, desired with almost sickening intensity something never to be described. In another place, Longfellow himself describes it. He says it's a feeling of sadness and longing, and get this, which is not akin to pain. It's not something that you regret feeling. You don't say, oh, this is a longing, it's painful, I don't want this. Isn't that interesting? Now, longing, like certain other passions, is directional. Do you know what I mean by that? You may just feel good. Well, your good feeling isn't toward anything or toward anybody. You just feel good. You wake up in the morning, you feel good. Somebody might say, who are you feeling good toward? And you think, what kind of a question is that? I just feel good. It's not directional. On the other hand, suppose you're angry. Your anger is almost certainly toward someone, right? Anger is toward someone. Anger is directional. Now, just like anger is directional, this longing is directional. All longing is directional. All longing is for something. And this longing is for something. So what is this longing for? To what is it trying to compel me? What do I want? Is what I want the moon? I say it's aroused often when I look at the moon. Well, surely not. If you could sign over the title to Earth Satellite to me and I could keep the moon in my garage, that longing wouldn't be satisfied. It would only attach itself to something else. Is what I want beauty? You know, we can go through a whole list of possible explanations, and people have given many explanations. They've tried to explain it away. Is what I want beauty? The moon is beautiful, but you know, when I gaze at the moon, I'm already beholding its beauty. I already am. If all I wanted was beauty, then I would be satisfied. On the contrary, rather than satisfying my longing, the sight of the moon merely stirs up that longing. It rakes it up. Well, is what I want to go to the moon? That's what I believed when I was a boy. I devoured stories of outer space and travel to the stars. And I have no doubt that setting foot on our silver sister would produce a sense of accomplishment and a temporary exaltation. Yeah, here I am. Yet I suspect that now I'd feel that longing standing on the moon and gazing back at the earth. Well, maybe if that's true, if I feel it, the longing for, when I look at the moon, but if I'm on the moon and I felt it looking at the earth, is what I long for the unattainable? Do I want unattainability as such? Do I like it because it's unattainable? Someone might think that the moon's very unattainability is the reason for its charm and that that's why attaining it would be anticlimactic, yet what does a theory like that really explain? A prize that is more difficult to attain might be more attractive to pursue than an easy one. That is, after all, the whole basis of the romantic strategy of playing hard to get. But on the other hand, to want something is to want to have it, isn't it? And to pursue something is to want to catch it. Who in his right mind would tell a thirsty man how lucky he was that whenever he reached for a drink, the water was withdrawn? Oh, how fortunate you are. You experience that longing for the unattainability. If I do attain the object of pursuit, but it leaves me unsatisfied, the proper conclusion, I think, is that what I really wanted, or at least what I also wanted, was something else. Well, is what I want to be united with the all? Some people say, oh, that's what it is, and this often leads to pantheism. Okay? Well, look, the all is interesting. I'm happy to be in a universe with snails and tomatoes and garlic and thunderstorms and galaxies and men's gym socks. But who would want to be united with the aggregate of all these things? I don't. To suppose myself united with the aggregate of everything, even if it's an interesting aggregate, is to suppose myself annihilated. If I'm all that collection of things, I'm not me any longer. Having been annihilated, I could hardly be satisfied in my longing because I wouldn't be at all. Is the longing I feel when I gaze at the moon, this is what Freud would say, is it merely the sublimation of my longing for a woman? Freud thinks everything is sex. Well, in that case, I wouldn't feel this longing any longer. Because, look, I've been married for 51 years to the bride of my youth. And I've experienced the satisfaction of eros, and love is sweet. But there's this about amorous embraces. They quench only amorous desire. They don't quench that other unknown desire that is associated with it. In fact, they provide that desire with new occasions, because now the power of the moon's face that I experienced even when I was a teen and a child is rivaled and outdone by the power of the face of my beloved. And the light that I see in my beloved's face is borrowed from somewhere else. Her face is but its mirror and receptacle. And my desire for her can be satisfied by her, but that desire for that of which her face is a receptacle cannot be. Is my longing merely this is what some evolutionary psychologists say. I had a radio interview about my book, and the guy was bringing out Darwin at me. And he said, well, this is just a genetically programmed response to the sight of faraway things in open spaces. See, our ancestors, according to a certain theory of where we came from, are supposed to have evolved on the savanna. This big open plain, right? Mountains far away, just nothing to see but grassland for a long time. Now, if we weren't adapted to that, if we weren't kind of comfortable in a situation like that, if we didn't kind of like it, then presumably we'd be miserable, and we probably wouldn't survive long enough to pass on our genes to our offspring, including the gene for liking it. And so that's one theory. People say, well, you like to look at the moon because, you evolved in the savannah, see? But even if there were an adaptive advantage in liking distant vistas, well, think about it. The fact remains that when I gaze at the moon, I don't just like it, I want something. An unappeasable ache moves in me, a plangent plucking of the strings, not a pain, yet more like a pain than a pleasure. What could be the adaptive value of having that? How does that help me pass on my genes to my descendants? Besides, although the moon is my chosen example, human history testifies that the coals of this ache can be raked up and blown into flame in people by all kinds of things. I don't know what these things might be for you, but in my case, another one of the things that rakes it up and blows it into flame is the very specific experience of hearing Johann Sebastian Bach's Air on the String of G. Wipes me out every time. Tell me how that helps pass on my genes to my descendants. I don't see a way. Could it be that my longing is not just for something beautiful, but for the beauty itself, for the infinite and original beauty of which the beautiful things of this world are but reflections? That was St. Augustine's answer. That was St. Thomas's answer. And I think here we're closing in on the quarry. Loveliness, is such a massive and bewitching reality that at times it threatens to undo us. And here's the thing about loveliness. This is what Augustine says. Now forgive me, because I'm going to read a pretty long paragraph here, but it's beautiful. Question the beautiful earth, he says. You're engaged in a dialogue with the beautiful things out there. Question them, he says. Question the beautiful earth. Question the beautiful sea. Question the beautiful air, diffused and spread abroad. Question the beautiful heavens. Question the arrangement of the constellations. Question the sun, brightening the day by its effulgence. Question the moon, tempering by its splendor the darkness of the ensuing light. Question the moving creatures that move about in the water, those that remain on the land, those that flit through the air. Question all these things, and they'll all answer, behold and see, we are beautiful. He says, their beauty is their confession. Their confession. That's the actual word. The word confession at the end of this passage is meant literally. A confession is a speech, a testimony, a speech in witness to something. And he views beautiful things as wordless, poignant testimonies or witnesses. He asks, who made these beautiful transitory things, unless it be the unchanging beauty? And he says the same thing about every good in this life. Not just beauty, all created goods are reflections of the unchanging good. Even something that you might want, like you might think happiness lies in power, happiness lies in sex, happiness lies in money. Think about it. He says this to God. Ambition seeks glory and honor, although you alone are to be honored before all and glorious forever. By cruelty the great seek to be feared, yet who is to be feared but God alone? From his power, what can be wrested away, or when, or where, or how, or by whom? The caresses by which the lustful seduce are a seeking for love, but nothing is more caressing than your beauty. Nothing is more caressing than your charity, nor is anything more healthfully loved than your supremely lovely, supremely luminous truth. Curiosity, the desire for knowledge, okay? He says that may be regarded as a desire for knowledge, whereas you supremely know all things. Ignorance and sheer stupidity hide under the names of simplicity and innocence. You know, you're just being stupid and you think, oh, I'm just an innocent person. He says, but no being has true simplicity like yours. God is not composed of parts. He's not a complicated machine, and none is more innocent than you, for it's their own deeds that harm the wicked. Sloth, laziness, pretends that it wants quietude, but what sure rest is there save the Lord? Luxuriousness would be called abundance and completeness, but you are the fullness and inexhaustible abundance of incorruptible delight. I won't read the whole passage, but you see how this is going. He says, fear is the recoil for a new and sudden threat to something one holds dear, and a cautious regard for your own safety, but nothing new or sudden can happen to you. Grief pines at the loss of things in which desire delighted, because it wills to be like you, from whom nothing can be taken away. Augustine's argument is that the only possible sense, remember I said, what if you had everything? And if you had virtue plus everything else, all that good fortune, it wouldn't be enough. Augustine's argument is that the reason it wouldn't be enough is that the only possible sense in which you can really have everything is to have God. Because all of the created goods that we desire are but pale reflections of the uncreated good that is himself. In a twisted way, he says, even those who are blown by the storms of greed and craving are trying to be like him who is all-sufficient. He says, thus even those who go from you and stand up against you are still perversely imitating you, but by the mere fact of their imitation, they declare that you are the creator of all that is, and that there is nowhere for them to go where you are not. Now, somebody might say, that's all illusion. We can satisfy our desires for earthly things, but we can't satisfy our longing for the eternal and infinite good because it doesn't exist. And if those earthly things aren't enough, as we've seen that they aren't, then tough. We have to settle. Grow up. Stop chasing after pixie dust. Life is hard and then it stops. You won't ever be happy. Can the objector be answered? I think he can. You know, even, I mentioned Aristotle, even that old pagan thinker knew that nature makes nothing in vain. Nothing in vain. What does that mean? That means nothing in nature is for nothing. In our own flatter idiom today, we might say everything in nature, and that includes our own nature, everything in us. Everything in us has a function, and that everything in us includes our natural desires. They are in us for a reason. They are always for something. You have a desire. It is for the satisfaction of that desire. I'm not saying, of course, that every specific thing that I desire is within my grasp. If I desire ice cream that tastes like the number 7 and is brought to me by fairies whenever I curl my toes, I'm going to be disappointed. But the generic object of every natural desire must exist. Why else would it exist? I naturally desire food in general because food is a real thing and I need it. Human life requires it. If there were no such thing as food, then there would be no such thing as the desire for food. I naturally desire friends because friendship is a real thing. And I need that too. If there were no such thing as friendship, then I wouldn't have that desire either. The function of natural desire is to point the way towards satisfaction. No natural desire exists unless its satisfaction is possible too. Now here comes the paradox. Because this desire, this strange longing that I've been talking about is a natural desire. But it's different than those other natural desires. Think, if for every natural desire, if it's really true, for every natural desire there is some possible satisfaction, and if, as we have learned from experience, nothing within our natural experience, nothing within our natural power can fully satisfy that transcendental desire of which I've been speaking, a desire which is also built into our nature, so that if no matter what we want, we're driven to ask, is this all there is? Then doesn't it follow by sheer logic, without any recourse to revelation, without any recourse to the Bible, without anything from the magisterium of the church, just by sheer philosophical reasoning, doesn't it follow that desire points beyond natural experience? That if we want to be fully happy, if we want that fulfillment that leaves nothing to be desired, it is possible, but we must go, so to speak, out of this world. And I'm not thinking of Mars. Thank you for your attention. Ask me anything. The gentleman back here will pass the microphone around so you don't have to belt out your question at top volume. Nobody ever wants to be the first one. You know, Canadians are very polite people, and I was speaking in Canada once. Usually, I have to wait for 30 seconds before anybody will ask a question after a talk, and then the questions start tumbling out. But this time I waited, and nobody asked any questions. So I thought, well, I guess there aren't going to be any. I said, well, thank you very much. The organizers dashed onto the stage, grabbed me, and said, wait. There are going to be questions. We're just very polite people. Nobody wants to speak. And I did, and sure enough, there were tons of questions. But nobody wanted to be the first. So come on, get over your shyness. Just go ahead and ask.
So how would you answer the question, what is happiness?
Well, I would say we have to make a distinction between imperfect happiness and perfect happiness. If you want that flawed, vulnerable, imperfect happiness that is nothing to sneeze at, but has all those weaknesses, then your best bet is to cultivate virtue and hope for luck. But if you want that abiding happiness that lulls all longing, leaves nothing further to be desired, is complete fulfillment, then you need to seek God with all your heart. And I will also say, you won't experience it completely in this life. People will sometimes say, well, you know, I go to church and I'm not completely fulfilled. Well, of course not. You're not in heaven yet. You're not gazing at the face of God. Even St. Paul talks about that. He says, we are groaning. We are groaning. We are waiting for the wedding feast of the Lamb. We now look as though in a mirror darkly, but then we will see face to face. That's happiness. Okay, yes.
Would you say happiness is the fruits of, or I guess, would it be a longing for fulfillment or the fruits itself of fulfillment?
Happiness is fulfillment. Happiness is fulfillment. It's thriving. It's flourishing. Okay. It is, yes, that's what I take happiness to be.
So
but we do have a longing for it, of course.
Okay. Is that our maximum? Is that the closest we can get in this life?
You mean practicing virtue and hoping for luck? No, I think that there's more even in this life. That's the most that you can get in this life just by your own powers. But you know, the vision of God in which complete fulfillment lies, even in this life we have glimpses of it, we have sparks of it, we have reflections of it. Sometimes God grants us that. And the amazing thing, now I've been talking about things that can be known just by reasoning, but I'm going to bring in some Catholic stuff, okay? I am Catholic. You all are Catholic, most of you. The philosophers who've, done the kind of hope for virtue and develop virtue, hope for luck thing haven't really been very good on this. They think, well, if you're unhappy, you're just unhappy. But we find that there can be a kind of a joy in offering our sorrows to God, to be united with his suffering and his sorrow on the cross. It unites us more closely to him. It's redemptive. I don't think that Paul, when he was in prison, I wouldn't call him a happy guy, but he had joy, which is an aspect of happiness, and he would sing. And the prison guards would say, "What is this? What is this?" They were even converts from that. Does that help?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you very much.
Sure.
I guess I probably didn't need the mic, but that's okay. I was going to ask, when you first started writing this book, were you Catholic? And if you were or weren't, how might that have affected how you got to your answer?
Well, I converted to Catholicism in about 2004, I think it was, and I wrote this book just in the last couple of years. This book was strongly influenced by my study of Thomas Aquinas. I wrote a book a couple of years ago it was a commentary, a line-by-line commentary on Thomas Aquinas' treatise on happiness and ultimate purpose, which is a part of the Summa Theologiae. Now that line-by-line commentaries are not exactly fun to read, and this was about 666 pages long, so I thought, well, I need to write something a little bit more adapted to the time that ordinary readers have, and that's where this book came from. Would it have been different? Well, even before I became Catholic, I was Protestant, but I was, for quite a while, I had been feeling that gravitational pull, that longing, and the insights of the church. For instance, the one that I was just expressing about sorrow. This was deeply moving to me. I'll give you a little story about that. When we were in RCIA, my wife and I, we always used to think, well, Protestants like to tell conversion stories. Catholics don't. How wrong we were. Everybody was sharing, well, what brought you here? How did you get here? And there was a couple behind us, and we said, we told them how we came to consider the Catholic Church, and they told us how they had. The fellow was a Protestant theology teacher at a seminary, but their son had committed suicide. It was a very sad thing. He was going to a boarding school, a very well-known one, to Austinites, and he became addicted to drugs. He was using drugs. He messed himself up dreadfully. The school didn't even tell them that he was in trouble. And the first that they even know of their son's problem is when they find that he'd killed himself. This sorrow just was devastating. And they said, it's a funny thing, they said. This is when we started thinking about Catholicism, because our Protestant friends were very good to us. They loved Jesus. They would try to be good to us, but they never mentioned our son. They never mentioned our sorrow, because they wanted to spare us that pain. And our Catholic friends, they said they talked about him all the time. And we understood there's some difference in understanding here of sorrow and how that's connected with joy. There's something different here. And we want to know about this and lead them into the church. So I guess that's not exactly would I have written this differently then, because I was coming to understand this already then, but it's with the help of the church that I came to understand it.
What made you convert?
What made me convert? Well, when I was a very young man, I had been raised a very faithful Baptist kid, okay? And I abandoned that in young adulthood because I thought that I was too smart for God. It was intellectual pride that did me in. It wasn't actually any argument against God. I just thought I see through everything. And when God reeled me back into faith, as in my upbringing, I'd always been taught Catholicism. It's just a lot of idolatry, and they worship statues and all of this sort of thing. Ironically, it was while I was outside of the faith that I learned that that wasn't what Catholics believed, and I began to understand what they did. I read Dante, I read Aquinas, I read Augustine, and I thought, gee, this stuff looks Christian to me. So when I came back into faith, I wanted to have a 1 foot in Catholic tradition, but still 1 foot in the Reformation, because I thought they were right about the doctrine of justification. Well, The denomination that I was in, which was one where I did have a chance to have one foot in each one, a denomination that prides itself on what it calls the middle way between Catholicism and Protestantism, was melting down totally. There was no authority. They didn't believe in anything any longer. It was devastating. It was my first crisis of faith since returning to faith in Christ. And I thought, Jesus, you promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against your church. They seem to be prevailing here. And the answer was, well, this is not my church. I began to look for where it was. And there was only one plausible candidate.
So if you say that the desire for a natural thing that we know exists, how do you explain the desire for the thing that we don't know what it is? Like when you look at the moon.
How do I explain desires for things you don't need?
For things that you don't know what it is.
Well, for what you don't know it is. Oh, well, there are all kinds of things. Even apart from this transcendental longing, which is really for God, there are many times when you want something and you don't know what it is. Sometimes you kind of feel restless and maybe lightheaded, and what you need is food, but you didn't know that was what you were needing, right? I mean, even something as material and everyday and obvious as that, there can often be times when we don't recognize what the desire is for. Now, that's true of the longing for God, too. C.S. Lewis is very good about this. He says, he thought that he had experimentally figured it out about God because he at first thought that he was a scholar of literature, and he enjoyed the beauty of literary works, and he thought that at first this was just a desire for beauty. But you can get beautiful things and they don't satisfy it. Well, is it a desire for this? That doesn't satisfy. Is it a desire for this? That doesn't satisfy it. You find out those are all mistaken identifications of the desire. And nothing is more common. The pagans knew about this too. Plato thought that that's one of the reasons why tyrants want power. It's really a longing for God, who is all-powerful. They wanted to be infinite like that, but they thought that just getting to do whatever they wanted was the way of doing it. People make that mistake about sex. People make that mistake about all kinds of things. I think it's mistaken identification.
I think a lot of times in evangelization, right, in sharing the faith with people, a common way to approach that is kind of this appeal to happiness and just asking someone, like, let's say someone who's kind of just pursuing the pleasures of the flesh, right, and just say, are you really happy? And I think a lot of times what's difficult is the person will say, yeah, like, this is working pretty well for me, right? My sense in that is that, I'm curious to hear your take on it. My sense is that sometimes the way that God works, and that is the person kind of has to like follow that road to its end.
I think so.
Like if I'm, if my happiness is, change the example a little bit, maybe my happiness is, the person who's joined this major just really because of the money, and they realize, well, there's sort of a glass ceiling, or I've gone as far as I can go in this career, and I'm, I still want more. So kind of letting the desire sort of run its course and realize there's still something more.
Yeah, here we go again. I think is this better? Okay. I think you're right. There are a lot of ways to think about this, letting the desire run its course. One fellow that I gave essentially this talk recently to the young Catholic professionals elsewhere in town, and a guy came up to me afterward and he said, I had a whole series. He says, I've always been a Catholic. I followed God. But I had a whole series of goals that I had set out for me. I was going to do this, and 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 I was going to achieve all my goals, and then I'd be happy. And I really worked hard at it. And he said, and I punched out my card, and I hit all those things about 1.5 years ago. And I thought, well, now what? Now what? Now, even with somebody who thinks that, who's pursuing a hedonistic approach to happiness, sleeping around, or food or whatever, even there, sometimes people can be helped along. You might say, well, how's that working for you? And they might say, well, it's working out pretty good. And what they mean is, pleasure is pleasurable. And of course, pleasure is pleasurable. But you can say, in the midst of all that pleasure, do you ever ask yourself, is that all there is? And most people might be a little startled by the question, but they'll say, well, yeah. I asked that question in a graduate seminar once. One of the common views in ethical philosophy, not the majority view, I'm glad to say, but it's out there, is that happiness is pleasure, not necessarily fleshly pleasure, but pleasure of some kind, you know. And it takes different forms. There's the ordinary hedonistic form, my pleasure. There's the utilitarian form, aggregate pleasure for everybody. And there was a young woman in the class in my seminar who said, that's what happiness is. Happiness is just pleasure. And I asked this question. I said, don't you have all that pleasure and does it satisfy you? Don't you ever ask, is that all there is? She got angry. She said, yes, of course I do. And I said, well then, doesn't that suggest that that's not really happiness, that it's not complete fulfillment? You know, there must be something else. And she said, there is no complete fulfillment. You're never going to be satisfied. That's just the way it is. You know, people will sometimes pitch their tent on a plain of salt. And I think that that's what she was trying to do. She was using bitterness as a defense against disappointment because she wasn't happy. There are various ways, and sometimes people say, oh, people are too consumed by happiness. They want to be happy all the time. They shouldn't want to be happy. Of course, people should want to be happy. It's not a good idea to obsess over anything, but of course they should want to be happy. Sometimes the problem, as in her case, is that people give up on it. They don't want to be happy enough. They say, I'm going to settle. And they're bitter about this. And sometimes a kind of a push along the way can help there too. Sometimes not, you're right. I think sometimes people have to just go to the end of the line. And then you never know. That doesn't always work. They go to the end of the line, what they were pursuing didn't make them happy, and then they might say, well, it wasn't that, it'll be this, and then they start on another line.
What would you say the best way to approach somebody who has no foundation in our faith or anything related with these principles?
I would say there's no one-size-fits-all approach. You have to, I hate to be trite, you have to listen with the ears of your heart, okay? And I think you have to pray like crazy. You have to pray before you talk to your friend. You have to pray while you're talking to your friend. You have to pray after you finish talking to your friend. and try to meet him where he is. Somebody who's bitterly unhappy and knows it can be approached in one way. Somebody who isn't really even interested in that question, but has angry questions about God, you know, needs an answer to that. And I think we also have to distinguish, because sometimes when people ask questions about God, sometimes a question is what it appears to be. It's an honest question. And then it needs to be met with the best effort that we can give with an honest intellectual answer. But sometimes it's not a question, it's a smokescreen. When Pontius Pilate is talking to Jesus and he says, what is truth? He wasn't opening a conversation. He was putting an end to it. He was driving a nail into it because he turns on his heel and he walks out of the room. Okay? He wasn't asking what is truth because he wanted to know the truth. And so you have to also recognize, you have to learn to recognize the questions. Is that a real question or is it a smokescreen? Give a real answer to the real question. If it's a smokescreen, try to pierce the smoke. Try to figure out what's behind it and speak to what's behind it. You know the conversation with the woman at the well? Okay. Okay, the Samaritan woman? It's so weird because Jesus at first doesn't seem to be answering anything that she says. He's answering according to what she's thinking, not what she's saying. He's answering according to what's behind that. And I think that there's a lesson for us there. We can't do it like he did, but we have to really listen hard and meet them where they are.
Excellent.
Some people also, the best approach is to dealing with the God question is talk about the God question. Some of them, they aren't going to be interested in that. But you can talk about all kinds of other things. You can talk about ethics, you can talk about something else, you can talk about how you make decisions in your life, you can talk about being practical and prudent, and it may lead to God because eventually everything is connected with God.
Thank you.
Bang.
So I was wondering if, like, the feelings that we typically associate with happiness, if they're not indicative of real happiness, is there any sort of signifiers that we found true happiness?
Okay, I heard part of that. This is how far I got. Are the feelings that are associated with happiness, and there was something about how they're not true happiness? There was something about the connection. What was it?
Oh, I was just wondering if there's like any sort of signifier that we found true happiness.
Oh, well, let's put it this way. I think if we're truly happy, we are going to have feelings of happiness. Okay? You can have good feelings of various sorts, and they might be nothing more than just bodily health, exuberance, which isn't going to stick with you and isn't the same as that foundation, which is what constitutes fulfillment and flourishing. So the feelings are important. We will have good feelings when we're happy, but the good feelings are not the same as happiness. Okay? If good feelings were the same as happiness, then people wouldn't have any idea what you were talking about when they're talking about their pleasures and you say, do you ever ask about all those good feelings? Is this all there is? They would say, what? But they all get it. Okay? Anybody else? This gentleman.
So you mentioned Plutarch in your
Yeah.
lecture. We just read a book in one of my classes by him called The Life of Lycurgus.
Yeah.
About Sparta and stuff. So my question is the entire like backbone of that society, Sparta, ancient Greece, was virtue, but it wasn't so much the choice of the person, it was more the laws of the society led towards virtue. So my question is, would that virtue, I know virtue is not the main thing that leads to happiness, but would that forced virtue, that blind virtue, lead towards happiness in the same way?
Is this a reasonable way for me to paraphrase your question so that I understand it?
Yes.
These Greeks were, by the way, there were a lot of hedonists and people like that in their society too, but it is true that some of their philosophers talked a great deal about virtue. And you're right that often, Aristotle especially, he's a very good example, and some of the Roman thinkers too, you mentioned Plutarch, associated virtue with the laws. They thought that the laws are preparation, that they form your character into virtue. So are you asking about the connection between virtue and the laws?
Yes.
Okay. I think I agree with Aristotle here. The laws are helpful. If you have a society where, look, developing virtue is not just a lot of book learning. We make this mistake today. After the Enron scandal about how long ago was that? A decade ago? I don't know. There was a big scandal with a corporation called Enron. There had been a lot of dishonesty. It was a huge thing. A lot of business schools said, oh, we're really failing to teach people ethics. Let's add some courses on business ethics to the curriculum. Well, that's not how you're going to make people virtuous, okay? And besides that, the courses weren't really on ethics. They were on what's called meta-ethics. They were theories of what makes an act ethical rather than just about being ethical. But how do you develop virtue? Well, first it starts in childhood. The parents need to, it is possible to attain virtue without this head start, but it's much, much more difficult. You know, you need to be raised by parents who will teach you sensibly. Don't take your sister's cupcake. You know, you've got your own cupcake. Come on, you're supposed to be sharing here. Don't pull his hair. How would you like it if he pulled your hair? You know, children eventually develop some good habits. Virtue itself is a kind of a habit. It's a habit of the heart, okay? It's a kind of a habit of how we choose and even a habit of how we feel and how we think and how we deliberate. And so you develop these habits, but you still don't have entire virtue because you don't know why you're doing this. This is just how you were taught. You get older, and now you reach the age of reason, and it's possible to begin talking to you. It's possible to, you might have said to Jimmy, Don't pull your sister's hair. How would you like it if she pulled your hair? And at the back of that question is the golden rule, right? But you didn't explicitly talk about the golden rule. Now you can start bringing that stuff up. You can say, this is why this is wrong. This is why this is right. This is why we teach you. You know, you try to live a different way. You just try to live selfishly. You're going to be a mess, Jimmy. And Jimmy begins to get it. Yeah, all right, that sort of makes sense. Now, Aristotle had pointed out that parental upbringing, if it goes through all these stages, is great, but there comes a point where even the best parents reach the end of their rope, because he says the father cannot coerce. What he means by that is the kid gets too big to spank. And so you've got to have good customs and folkways and laws and ways of doing things in your society. You know, for example, consider how hard is it for people to get a sensible understanding of marriage and dating and family and sexuality when everything is drenched in sex and you can't even drive down the road without seeing lurid things on billboards. Or when a guy is sitting at his computer and in 2 clicks he's got pornography that 40 years ago you would have had to go to great difficulty to obtain. And it's very hard. The society is against you. So you need good laws, and laws doesn't just mean stuff on the books that the government enforces. It means laws in the informal, the unwritten sense too. You need good customs. So yes, that's important. Now, even there, that doesn't guarantee it, because custom is not something involuntary. Virtue is not something involuntary. It is about the way that you make choices. It's ultimately about the disposition of your will. You have to be voluntarily aligned by this. And then, even then, and the pagans never got this part, you eventually hit a wall. You try to be good, and there's something you can't overcome. Why do I keep getting angry with her? Why do I keep doing this? You know, what is that? And Paul talks about that. He says, I have the law in my mind, but I find I'm not doing it. He's talking about his unredeemed self. He's not talking about his life with Christ. He says, that which I want to do, I don't do. That which I don't want to do, I find myself doing. Who will save me? And he says, well, Christ will. We need the grace of God. We need actual assistance. This is a practical, everyday thing, and we depend on that too. So that's not about the law. That way transcends the law, but the law is important in that, sure. Yes, ma'am.
So, as someone who is Protestant like yourself,
yes.
how would you say for a Catholic person to approach the conversation with Protestant about the church and just the faith in general?
Well, first of all, let me say that I'm still profoundly grateful to my Protestant parents and friends and Protestants. I mean, that's where I first heard the gospel. I'm grateful. I didn't know that was all good Catholic stuff. A lot of that was all good Catholic stuff too. How would I approach a Protestant? Well, like I said before, that there's no one-size-fits-all thing. It would depend on the person that I was speaking to. Is the person interested? Is he interested in discussing the faith? You know, like, I used to think that you guys were just superstitious idol worshippers, and you don't seem to be, but why do you do this weird stuff? Or why do you believe that the Pope can't ever be mistaken about anything? You know, and you can say, well, that's not what we think about the Pope. So it may be that we begin with questions, or it may be something else, or it may be an invitation to come to Mass. I know somebody once who, it happened this way. She was a biology graduate student, and another biology graduate student who had been a Mormon, actually. He was not a Protestant, he was a Mormon. He thought that she was really pretty, she was really nice, he liked her, and he wanted to date her. She said to him, well, you're a nice guy, I would be willing to date you, but you have to understand something about me. We believe that dating is about finding a suitable marriage partner. And I couldn't marry somebody who is not Catholic. So you'd have to be willing to come to church with me and learn about this. And he said, well, all right, that seems fair, but then we're going to have to go to a bunch of Protestant churches too. And she said, okay. So they did that. And actually, what really persuaded him was when she took him one day to adoration. There was the Blessed Sacrament, and the feeling, the sense of the presence of God and of holiness was overpowering to him. And so every time he went to a Protestant church then, he would ask, it was very funny. As he went out the door, he always asked the minister, he said, "Excuse me," he said, "Thank you, it was very nice being here today. But, you know, when you have Holy Communion, what do you do with the bread and wine afterward?" And they said, "Well, you know, we flush what's left over down the sink," or something like that. And he said, nope, they don't get it. He eventually was drawn into the church. So now that was a different story than most people would have, right? But it just depends on who it is. And I think always you have to we believe that Protestants are, although separated from us in a certain way, they are our brothers in Christ, and so we always have to do this with great respect. Does that help? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Wojciechowski. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.